Hi, it's Derek Weeks with Sonatype, and I am here with Brian Fox, our Chief Technology Officer, also co-founder of Sonatype. So super excited to have Brian on because we're going to talk about a topic that Brian and I actually talk a lot about out in the community, and that is what's happening with the integrity of open source components, open source repositories, et cetera, that are out in the market. One of the things that we've been seeing a lot in the news, and we've tracked continuously through our State of the Software Supply Chain report over the last couple of years, has been situations where there's malicious code that is injected into open source components that are then downloaded by the community. So I wanted to first, ask Brian, what's your take on what we're seeing out in the market with these malicious code injection attempts, many of them which are successful, which we're reading about in the press?
Yeah, I think we've seen a market increase over the last 2 years of these types of attacks happening on open source components and repositories. I think the bad guys have kind of figured out that this is an effective weapon that there aren't great defenses for, and so they're leveraging the popularity of open source. They're leveraging the proclivity of these types of tools to automatically update. Updating dependencies to the latest and greatest can usually be a good thing, except if the latest and greatest happens to be one that's counterfeit and put there by a bad guy, and you got millions of people downloading it almost immediately. It's a sweet target for malicious actors.
Yeah, and is this really about, I talk to people about, look, this is just the most efficient way. If you're an adversary, why wait for a new vulnerability to be announced and then go and prey upon it? Why not just create your own vulnerability in a popular component? Is that really what's prompting this, or do you think there's something else that's prompting it within the adversary community?
We saw the start of this happen with a study that came out 2 summers ago, talking about how so much of the publisher credentials for things like NPM were either already compromised or easily compromised by a dictionary attack. So in other words, the security sophistication of the average publisher was so low that anybody could easily crack that. Or mine the passwords. They were checked into GitHub and publicized all over the place. That really seemed to be the start of this. It seemed like from there, those credentials were then leveraged to attack other components. One of the first indicators that I saw that was really, the first time I saw it, it was a surprise. And, sometimes you see something, you look around the room like, did anybody else see that? Was a couple of attacks that came out that were targeting the publisher credentials themselves, right? So usually we're used to seeing exploits that are injecting crypto miners or stealing passwords or stealing, other types of things. But this one was targeting the environment variables for the publishers themselves, which I think then led to additional compromises where those credentials were then used. So it was sort of a long game of chained attacks, leaping from one thing to the next to the next. And I think that's why we've really seen this take off.
And when back in the day when you and Jason first set up the central repository, did you imagine these kind of things taking place with people stealing credentials or putting bad things in the repository that the developers out there would need to be aware of?
Well, certainly when we built out Maven Central, the idea that things were immutable, that things couldn't just disappear were there, so by design, things like left pad couldn't happen. But stealing of credentials, I mean, to some extent, yes, because we required things be signed with PGP signatures. Now, those can be compromised as well. But, from the beginning with Central, there were multiple layers of protection in that regard. Now, nothing is bulletproof, and I don't think we sat down and expected that we would see this type of attack at such a large scale, but we tried to do the best we could at that time.
And so what are you seeing as well in terms of people protecting themselves on these things? Is it really just a matter of, hey, this thing made news that, Copay a couple of months ago and event stream, like we're finding out about this stuff in the news. The NPM security team caught, an instance of this. Some, curious developer out there figured out something wasn't right and raised questions. Is there really any, any way that companies are trying to manage this today to get a sense of what's going on with counterfeit components?
Well, I think, unfortunately, to date, so far, the technologies available are sort of the same old things. Try to pick better components from maybe foundationally supported projects that tend to have better practices in place than just one guy writing code on a weekend. But those aren't a guarantee either. And short of that, the state of the art looks like trying to delay your developers from picking up the latest releases. So intentionally slowing down all updates in the case that one of them might be bad. And, for a while, when we first saw this starting to happen, it seemed like most of the bad things were uncovered within days or a week, 2 weeks tops, right? So for a while, it seemed like if you just delayed updating some of these components by 2 weeks, you'd avoid all the noise. But as we saw with Copay and some of the other ones that happened, the event stream one you referred to, those played out over months. And so clearly it's not feasible to wait months to update to a new version or to prove out that something doesn't have known problems with it.
Yeah, and so you've been a part of a number of open source projects over the years as a contributor maven for a long time. How are you going to understand if your co-contributors in that project are doing something, they're contributing good code or good changes to the code, but all of a sudden they introduce an extra space, which, helps introduce a backdoor in the code. How are you going to tell if you're not a security pro in that kind of instance?
Yeah, it's really impossible. And but that said, I feel like the majority of the problem doesn't exist with projects that have many contributors. I think those tend to, have enough people looking at things, certainly at foundations like Apache and Eclipse. Where the problem lies is where we've sort of made it super easy for anybody to create new modules, especially on the JavaScript side, and share them. And those tend to be one or two people doing it very sporadically. And so when their credentials get compromised, it can be a long time before they notice it because they may not be even working on that project for months, right? And that was sort of the case with some of the more recent ones. And with the Copay one, it was a case where somebody came along to a very popular but mostly dormant project and started contributing. And to that person, because I've been that person on a project where nobody else was working on it, it's a relief to have some help come along to pick up the shovel and start digging for you for a while. And so it's not surprising that it was fairly easy to take that over. So the challenge is, as a consumer of open source, it has traditionally been very difficult for you to understand the models going on behind these open source projects. How good are the practices? How many contributors are there? What's the turnover? Those types of things. That's one of the things that we're looking at trying to make easier.
So you and the rest of our R&D team have been looking at this problem. I mean, clearly we've been looking at this and recognizing the trend for a couple of years, but you guys have started to make some investments within the R&D part of our organization to start to build new technologies and new ways to approach looking at this problem to potentially help organizations understand if the code they're working with is counterfeit, if there are any abnormal behaviors. Tell us some about some of the kind of behavioral analysis that we're starting to do within Sonatype.
Yeah, so like I said, for a long time, I was talking about this problem, and people would come up and ask me after, how do I avoid it? And the answer was not great, wait 2 weeks until 2 weeks wasn't long enough. So we really started looking at the type of data that we can observe around the components, and we set out to basically be able to almost in a zero trust model, that you can't trust the contributor because the contributor may be intentionally malicious, or their credentials may have been compromised. It may look like the same person or somebody with a lot of karma, but it's not actually them, right? So we started out, can we look at the release itself of a particular project and determine that there's something unusual about it? It was a lot of work. It requires some machine learning types of techniques to be able to understand the behaviors of the people working on the projects, the behaviors of the project itself, the dependencies of that project, and try to understand what is the baseline behavior, and make an instant snap judgment call on the new release. So understanding, is this new release likely to be trustworthy, or are there a certain number of conditions that indicate that the risk is significantly higher? And in that case, if the risk is higher, you might want to wait. Now, we've talked a lot about malicious components here because that's kind of what triggered all this. It's the thing that people pay attention to, but malicious components is not the only area of increased risk, right? And I talk sort of in a related way about this problem, what I call the .0 problem, right? So right now, I'm sitting there with my iOS devices waiting for iOS 13.1 to come out because I heard that there were lots of problems with 13.0, right? That's not surprising for a lot of people. This happens every time there's a major release of software. Why? Because so much has changed. There's new functionality. Humans write it, it's likely to have problems. And we all come to understand that that is an expected risk at a new major release of software. Well, what if the version number didn't change and yet a whole bunch of things underneath the hood changed? That happens a lot in open source. New contributors might be adding code to this release that had never worked on it before. They might not be bad guys, they just might not know all the ins and outs of the code. Or there may be a lot of dependencies that have been updated, or new dependencies have been added. These kinds of things, as a consumer, I would like to know about, because if I'm in a hurry to get my release out, I might not be willing to take on that extra risk right now of updating it. And so what we're trying to do is baseline that risk to be able to provide the deviation from the norm of the behavior and all of these types of things. And we're pretty sure that most of these malicious types of events will also be trapped in these increased risk profiles. Because if we look back at all the different types of malicious attacks that have happened, they've been one permutation of all those things I just mentioned or another. Either a new guy showed up, or his or her credentials were compromised, and so they were releasing from a different part of the world that they've never been on before, or new dependencies were created out of thin air. That was the case of the event stream one. The malicious code wasn't added to event stream. The malicious code was added to a newly created module, and then event stream was made to depend upon it. That's a fishy kind of thing, right? So these are the types of behaviors that we're looking at, so that we can assign that risk score, and then customers with our products can use that in the policy to determine how long they want to back off of an update. So it allows them to do something like an adaptive access control, right? So this is risky. Let's wait and reevaluate tomorrow and see if the risk has decreased over time before we jump in with everybody else.
Yeah, and you've already been collecting data related to these kind of characteristics or attributes for some time now. So it's not like today we're announcing we know how to do it. We're going to start collecting data. We've been collecting it for some time now to get a sense of kind of what are the patterns out there. What are we seeing within these patterns? Are they actionable patterns in the behaviors with the projects, right?
That's right. That's right. It's been a long time that we've been working on this kind of under the hood as we've been talking about it and observing what's been happening. But a couple of months ago, we were able to start sending useful data to our security research team that they can act upon and create the types of events that our customers would want to know about. And we continue to push the state of the art on that, ultimately driving towards being able to surface the risk score directly in our products and allow the policy to act upon it in real time. That's where we're intending to go.
Yeah, and this is what we've talked for a long time as a company about software supply chain management, software supply chain automation, and a lot of what the market sees in this A lot of the buying behavior or headlines out there are really pointed toward the cybersecurity aspects, and that tied to malicious code in this particular case. But I think it really just points to, there are a lot of suppliers out there that we deal with, and those suppliers being open source projects, and 2,400 on average. And we need to know, are we utilizing the best suppliers and the best parts from those suppliers, and the suppliers with the best track record for those parts in terms of updating those parts, keeping them up to date, releasing new capabilities, releasing frequently, as a result of releasing frequently, coincidentally or consequently removing security vulnerabilities through those updates as they're more frequent, as we've seen in the software supply chain report this year. So, it really plays toward this broader message of what we've been trying to do around software supply chain management, software supply chain automation, and helping people make better decisions about the suppliers and the parts that they're consuming, right?
That's right. Yeah, I mean, we're seeing and tracking, at the last I counted, something like 30,000 individual releases every single day, right? That's a lot of choice out there, a lot of stuff to evaluate, and if your developers are picking this stuff up and integrating it right away, and that component was malicious, your supply chain has been compromised immediately. And I think that's an aspect of this that we didn't really touch upon, but is important for people to understand. When these attacks are targeting your developers or your infrastructure, because they're stealing AWS keys or production database keys or something of that it doesn't matter if you didn't release the software to your customers yet. You were the target. As soon as the developers pulled it down, which would have happened as soon as it hit the repo in many of these cases, you're compromised. It's game over, right? And that's the dynamic that has really changed in this attack, is that you don't have that leeway between when you start to integrate it and when you release to find that something is fishy. By the time you notice it's fishy, it's already passed.
Yeah, and some of the adversaries out there know what your application is. They've used basic tools to take an inventory of what open source components you're using, whether that's enterprise premium tools on the market or all the free tools on the market that will give you a software bill of materials and tell you, here are the components that are in this. And then they can work backwards to figure out, okay, which is a project that I can go and start contributing to, knowing that this particular application relies on that project or that supplier. And then, I know my path into the organization. So it's not that difficult to actually construct the scenarios that we've been talking about. In fact, it seems like one of the easier paths to approach if you're an adversary and you have economic interest in going after these targets.
That's right.
So, all right. Well, cool, Brian. Thanks for getting on this conversation with me. Very much appreciated. Always good to see you. And for those of you that will be at All Things Open in a couple of weeks, mid-October, Brian and I will both be there presenting in different sessions, but you can meet us live and in person. Come by and say hi.
Bye.
Thanks.